Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'm going to be covering the weather for June 7th of 2023. Currently there are 5 marginal risks across different parts of the United States, extending from East Coast all the way to West Coast. There's marginal threats for South Carolina and parts of North Carolina and Georgia, marginal threats for the eastern coast of Florida, marginal threat for the places that just can't catch a break from severe weather, all the way up north for eastern North Dakota and South Dakota, and all the way west for parts of Idaho, Oregon, California, and northern Nevada, and places we don't typically see a whole lot of severe weather potential. So it's all over the place today. We don't really have all that much of a tornado threat right now, but we do have a 5% wind threat and a 5% hail threat as well for all marginal threats. We don't really have all that much of a tornado threat, but we maybe could see one tomorrow as the subtropical jet increases, possibly, but it may not be likely. It all depends. We'll have to see tomorrow. Taking a look at the pivotal weather models, the low pressure system for the western United States that has pulled the subtropical jet northward for yesterday and today is starting to weaken and allow the subtropical jet to continue across Texas as it weakens across California. However, this subtropical jet, as it is being pulled up just slightly, should be enough to trigger some severe weather development in that marginal threat area. We do have a huge low pressure system situated over the New England area with mid-level flow and low-level flow circling across the eastern United States out of Canada to trigger severe weather in the marginal threat area. And we do have the subtropical jet that is coming out of Mexico and impacting Florida to trigger the severe weather development there. We don't really have a whole lot of a clear triggering factor for the eastern marginal threat for North Dakota and South Dakota. However, it is definitely noticeable. We do have a kind of a weak low pressure system. It's not really all that much of a increase or decrease, I should say, compared to the low pressure systems across the various portions of the United States, but it is definitely enough to trigger some severe weather development, and it is rotating clockwise, which is anticyclonic. This should help trigger severe weather development across eastern North Dakota and South Dakota. Focusing on the wind shear possibilities for Florida, we could possibly see a little bit of wind shear to help contribute to our hail potential, but it shouldn't contribute all that much towards a tornado potential because the subtropical jet is relatively weak. As well as for the marginal threat back towards the northern United States, we don't really see all that much of notable or strong mid-level flow, so wind shear is expected to be relatively weak and keeping hail sizes likely in the small. Wind shear back towards the eastern United States should be fairly noticeable compared to the other regions of the United States. However, wind shear should stay relatively weaker. But then taking a look at Texas, where we saw tons of tornado potentials last week, the subtropical jet is still relatively weak and I think slowly increasing over the next few days. So wind shear should overall be relatively weak. But those are the main triggering factors for severe weather development across the United States. I will get a little bit into the triggering factors for eastern North Dakota and South Dakota. It is a little bit more complicated, but I will show you guys why there is a severe weather development potential there. Taking a look at the dew points across the United States of America, let's focus on the marginal threat that's back towards the western coast. That marginal threat isn't really expected to see all that much of strong notable dew points or strong CAPE values at all, as dew points are expected to be mostly in the low 50s to upper 40s, which should be enough for severe weather development and a little bit of instability, but definitely not nowhere near the moderates, mostly in the triple digits to possibly the low 1000s. But then let's take a look at the Texas marginal threat. The marginal threat is mostly isolated in this region of New Mexico and Texas. Dew points in that area are expected to be mostly in the the 40s further out west, but mostly in the 50s and possibly the upper 50s further out east. This should help contribute to dew points that are in the moderates depending on lapse rates. But then let's take a look at the marginal threat that's for Florida. That subtropical jet is expected to continue to pull some major amounts of humidity across the Florida Peninsula and trigger some relatively stronger instability compared to everywhere else, with dew points in the mid to low 70s. Depending on lapse rates, we could possibly see Cape values up to the upper 2000s. Then let's take a look at the marginal threat for South Dakota or South Carolina and North Carolina. We do have dew points in that marginal threat that are kind of in the low 60s, but mostly in the mid 50s to upper 50s. But then let's take a look at the marginal threat that's for eastern North Dakota and South Dakota. In this region, pay attention to this region in particular. This region is expected to have a humidity pool with deeper humidity compared to everywhere else except for Florida, with dew points in the mid to upper 60s. It is displaying a little bit of the low 70s, but because of it's such a small area and so weak, I don't think dew points in the 70s are possible realistically. But this is going to help with a instability pool, depending on lapse rates, to help trigger severe weather development, specifically in that region where we have the much deeper blues. Taking a look at the lapse rates across the United States in the various marginal threats, let's take a look at where we actually see some notable lapse rates compared to the location of the marginal threat. In that marginal threat location, there are dew points that are in the mid to upper 6s and possibly the upper 7s as well, and not really expected to be all that much in the 9s as they're further down south. But because of how weak dew points are, Cape is not expected to get as high as it possibly could with these lapse rates if we had dew points, say, in the mid to upper 60s. But then let's take a look at the marginal threat back towards eastern North Dakota. We don't really see all that much of a strong notable lapse rates pool, but those dew points should keep values up there. But then let's take a look at Florida. We don't have all that much of a strong notable lapse rates pool either. And you can also see that with South Carolina as well. We have relatively weaker lapse rates, which could potentially decrease our Cape values a little bit compared to if we had stronger lapse rates. Then they could possibly get up to the 3000s and possibly the weak 4000s with those extreme moisture values if we had strong lapse rates for Florida. But because we don't, Cape values are expected to stay mostly in the potentially the upper moderates. But then let's take a look at South Carolina marginal threat. We don't really have all that strong lapse rates, so Cape values are expected to continue to stay in the weaker 1000s to possibly the triple digits, not so much in the 2000s. So that's currently what we're looking at as far as lapse rates. Let's take a look at the instability across the United States, starting off with the marginal threat that's further to the west coast. We do have Cape values that are definitely expected to stay in the triple digits to possibly the low 1000s in some areas, but mostly in the triple digits. But then with those deeper dew points back towards the eastern North Dakota and South Dakota threat, those deeper dew points but lack of strong lapse rates are going to keep Cape values mostly in the 1000s to 2000s, possibly the 2000s 500 range, not really expected to be in the 3000s like it's depicting. Taking a look at the marginal threat back towards Texas, Cape values are expected to stay mostly in the moderates with whatever lapse rates we have, and dew points that are mostly in the mid-50s. Cape values are expected to stay in the triple digits to low to mid 1000s. But then taking a look at the instability back towards the Florida marginal threat, instability is expected to stay kind of in the 1000 to 2500 range, possibly in the upper 2000s. There is some depiction of 3000 some locations, but that is expected to be not really all that realistic. But then let's take a look at the marginal threat back towards South Carolina. Cape values are expected to stay mostly in the moderates, just like everywhere else, in the triple digits to 1000s to possibly the weak 2000s in some locations, but it's likely going to be very isolated, but definitely very possible. Across all these locations, with whatever wind shear we have, I will get into wind shear compared with our Cape values, but this is going to mostly contribute to the possibility of some small to medium sized hail. But with relatively weaker expected wind shear, hail is mostly going to stay mostly in the small to medium sizes across all marginal threats. Taking a look at wind shear across the various marginal threats, keep in mind the Cape values for the various locations. The only place that we should see notable wind shear, which could be sufficient enough for some tornadic development, if Cape values were high enough, and that location would be the marginal threat for South Carolina. However, again, Cape values, as I said just a second ago, are expected to be relatively weaker and not support any tornadic development. However, with increased wind shear, as you see going forward, is definitely going to provide the possibility of some mid-level rotation, as well as the possibility of a little bit of a funnel cloud, but probably not all that much. It's probably going to be pretty rare for that to happen with wind shear like this, but definitely possible. However, this wind shear is going to allow for the possibility of some small to medium sized hail. But then let's take a look at the possibility of hail for the Florida marginal threat. The wind shear of the subtropical jet is expected to be relatively weak, as it has to pass through Mexico and be weakened down by the Mexican mountains. So wind shear is not expected to be all that strong, but wind shear is definitely sufficient enough for the possibility of some small hail. Mostly isolated small hail in some regions. But then let's take a look at the marginal threat back towards eastern North Dakota and South Dakota. Wind shear is expected to be weakly isolated, so isolated small hail could be possible, but I think medium-sized hail I don't think is going to be all that possible. But then let's take a look at the marginal threat back towards the western United States. Wind shear is expected to be weakly isolated, just like back in North Dakota and South Dakota, so some isolated small hail could definitely be possible as well. But then let's take a look finally at the marginal threat back towards New Mexico and Texas. Some isolated, some relatively stronger wind shear compared to everywhere else is expected to possibly allow for some medium to small size hail, but really not all that much of a tornadic possibility either. Before I would like to end today's forecast, I am going to switch back to the mid-level flow because I want to take a look at the smoke intensity back towards the New England area. I know that you guys are getting a lot of smoke towards much of the New England area, definitely across mostly New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware, back in that area. And that's because there are fires, as you know, back in Quebec. But the reason that all this smoke is being blown down south and affecting this region is because of this low pressure system trough. The low pressure system being right here and all the fires being right here. This trough is at the worst time possible and worst position possible to blow all that smoke from all those fires all the way down south to affect areas across the New England area and much of the eastern coast. I am also getting a little bit of smoke smell in the air as well, and I can definitely smell the smoke from the Quebec fires. So that's the major reason why you guys are getting a lot of that smoke from the Canada fires. Hopefully this low pressure system should move out soon and prevent the mid-level flow from pulling all that smoke down south. But that is the main reason why you guys are getting all that smoke. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator, and hopefully I will see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.